Tonight we uncover a fear the Vatican never buried, one that still lingers in candlelit halls in sealed vaults. A fear not of devils or heretics, but of something far older, far more dangerous: Egyptian magic. Long before the rise of the Church, the temples of Egypt held secrets about the soul, time, and the power of spoken words. They called it Heka, the force that shapes reality. It wasn't superstition, it was precision, and it worked. When Christianity spread, this magic didn't vanish. It was absorbed, rewritten, silenced, but not destroyed. Buried inside forbidden texts, hidden in chants no one was allowed to hear, locked in rooms even cardinals cannot enter. This story is not about fantasy. It is about control. Because if you can speak to the divine without a priest, you don't need a church. If your soul holds power, you cannot be ruled. And that is what they feared. So before you scroll past and forget, ask yourself, what did they erase and why are they still afraid? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we open the book they tried to erase, and the words are still alive. It was supposed to be locked away forever, but one afternoon in 1824, a crumbling chest arrived at a museum in France. Misfiled, mislabeled, forgotten. Inside, wrapped in decaying linen, was a papyrus older than anything in the museum's archives. At first glance, it looked like any other funerary scroll. But then someone translated the first line and everything changed. The papyrus didn't speak of gods or burial rites. It spoke of light, of breath, of a force that could shape the world with sound alone. It read more like a spell book than a religious text, and within days, word had reached Rome. Quietly, urgently, the Vatican dispatched emissaries to the museum. Their mission: acquire the scroll, no matter the cost. By the time the scholars returned to study it again, it was gone. No record, no explanation, just an empty drawer. But why? Why would the Church care about an old Egyptian spell? The answer lies in what the scroll described. It told of priests who could command winds with a whisper, of temples built to echo human voices into power, of symbols that weren't just writing, but tools when spoken correctly, they could pierce the veil between worlds. It was not mythology, it was instruction, and that terrified the Vatican. Because if even a fraction of it was true, then the Egyptians weren't just builders of tombs. They were keepers of something far older, far more dangerous. A kind of knowledge that didn't rely on faith, but on direct experience. You didn't need to believe in a god. You just needed to speak the right words in the right order, at the right time. The Church couldn't allow that. Not then, not now. That scroll has since become a ghost story among archivists. Some say it's hidden beneath the Vatican Library, sealed in a lead case. Others claim copies exist in coded texts, smuggled out by monks who couldn't bear to destroy it. A few even believe that fragments of its language were buried inside early Christian prayers, cloaked in Latin, altered just enough to stay hidden. What's certain is this: it should not have been found. And once it was, it vanished again, but not before leaving behind a trail. Whispered references in old letters, sketches in forbidden notebooks, and one curious fact that no one can quite explain. After the papyrus disappeared, the Vatican quietly updated the list of banned texts, not with a title, just a catalog number, one that doesn't exist in any public system. So the question is no longer whether the papyrus was real. It's whether the Church still fears what it might reveal. Because if the ancient Egyptians knew how to speak power into being, then everything we've been told about prayer, ritual, and the divine changes. Maybe the Vatican wasn't protecting us from a hoax. Maybe they were hiding a truth we were never supposed to pronounce. There was a time when people looked up at the stars and saw gods with animal faces. Not monsters, not demons, just symbols of power, balance, and mystery. Anubis guarded the dead. Thoth watched over wisdom and writing. Sekhmet could bring both healing and destruction. These were not evil beings. They were forces of nature. They were teachers, protectors, guides. But that all changed when a new story began to take hold in the ancient world, and the people telling it needed to make sure no one looked back. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it faced a problem. Egypt, a land where religion wasn't just belief. It was woven into every wall, every scroll, every heartbeat. Egyptian temples had stood for thousands of years before the first gospel was written. Their gods weren't going away easily.
So the early church made a decision. If it couldn't erase Egypt, it would twist it. And that's exactly what happened. Anubis, once the quiet guardian of the dead, became a symbol of darkness. His jackal head suddenly looked demonic. Set, who represented chaos and transformation, was rewritten as evil itself. Even Thoth, the god of knowledge, was reduced to a shadowy figure in old Christian texts. Their statues were broken, their temples were converted, and their names were quietly replaced with things like Satan, Lucifer, and Devil. But it wasn't just name-calling, it was strategy. By labeling these gods as demons, the church gave people a reason to fear them, not question them, not understand them, just fear them. And it worked. Within a few generations, entire mythologies were gone. Sacred symbols became warning signs. Powerful words were left untranslated. The gods were buried, but not forgotten. Because if you look closely, you can still see them in stained glass windows, in old manuscripts, even in the hidden corners of cathedrals. The winged figures, the animal masks, the eyes that watch without blinking. They're not Christian, not really. They're echoes of something older, something the church couldn't completely erase. The question is why they tried so hard in the first place. Maybe it was about control. Egyptian magic taught people that power could come from within, that you could speak to the divine without a priest. The death wasn't an end, but a doorway. Those ideas didn't fit the new system. They made people too free. And freedom is dangerous when you're building an empire of belief. So the gods became demons. Their stories became threats. And their wisdom was locked behind walls labeled forbidden. But not forever. Today, scholars and seekers are unearthing those old stories, translating lost texts, reclaiming names that were once feared. And the more we learn, the more obvious it becomes. These gods were never evil. They were just in the way. For centuries, the walls of Egypt spoke a language no one could understand. Temples covered in strange symbols, tombs filled with carved animals, birds, eyes, suns. People thought they were decorations or secret codes. But the truth was more dangerous. These symbols were not just pictures, they were words. And the church wanted them to stay silent. Before anyone could read hieroglyphs, the Vatican had already decided they were a threat. In the Middle Ages, church scholars warned that the Egyptian script was the language of sorcerers, that to study it was to invite madness. Some even believed hieroglyphs held spells, that saying them out loud could open doors better left shut. So they banned it, quietly but completely. Any books that tried to decode the symbols were destroyed. Scholars who showed too much interest were excommunicated. Libraries that held Egyptian texts were mysteriously burned. But the real reason behind the fear wasn't magic, it was memory. Hieroglyphs recorded a version of history that didn't match the Bible. Stories of gods who came from the stars, of time before time, of people who lived thousands of years before Adam and Eve. The church couldn't allow those ideas to spread. If hieroglyphs were ever translated, it would challenge everything. So they made sure no one could even try. For hundreds of years, the symbols were treated like a dead language from a lost world. Until a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion decided not to listen. In 1822, after years of obsession, he cracked the code using the Rosetta Stone. He realized hieroglyphs weren't just symbols, they were sounds, a full written language. And once he read them, the past began to speak, and what it said shocked everyone.
The texts described advanced astronomy, precise calendars, rituals older than the flood, spells for protection, healing, and travel beyond the body. These weren't primitive people. They were scientists, mystics, timekeepers, keepers of a history that predated every Western scripture. And suddenly, all the fear made sense, because the church hadn't been wrong to be worried. If people could read these walls, they might start asking questions, big ones, about where we come from, about who holds the truth, about what was erased to make room for a new religion. After Champollion, hieroglyphs became history, safe to study, neatly placed behind glass. But even now, some translations are kept locked away. Some tombs are sealed off without explanation, and certain passages from ancient texts are missing from the official record. So maybe the question isn't why the church banned hieroglyphs. Maybe the question is what they still don't want us to read. Because every time a wall is translated, a piece of the story comes back. And maybe one day, when enough of the symbols are understood, the full truth will return. Not just about Egypt, but about everything. The Egyptians didn't think words were just sounds. They believed words were alive, that speaking something could shape the world around you, that the right phrase said at the right time could heal, destroy, protect, or even raise the dead. Words weren't just communication, they were magic. And that kind of belief made the early church very nervous. In ancient Egypt, there was no real line between prayer and spell. When a priest chanted a name, it wasn't a wish, it was a command. Names themselves had power. The more secret a name was, the stronger it became. They carved these names into tombs and temples to protect the dead from harm. If your name was erased, it was said your soul would vanish forever. But if your name was spoken, especially in a ritual, you could live again. In a way, memory was immortality. Spoken words kept the spirit alive. Now, imagine a religion like that crossing paths with one that taught salvation came through silence, obedience, and one holy book. It was only a matter of time before there was a clash. The early church believed that only the Word of God had real power. Everything else had to be controlled. Magical speech, especially the kind used by Egyptian priests, was seen as dangerous and sinful. It gave people too much access, too much freedom. If someone could speak to the divine without a priest or a church, what was the point of religious authority at all? So the church labeled it heresy. Ancient chants were banned. Coptic prayers that mixed Christian and Egyptian styles were censored or destroyed. The idea that words themselves could have energy was twisted into something evil, witchcraft, blasphemy. Even speaking in certain ways could get you punished, or worse. But in secret, the Vatican kept records. They studied ancient Egyptian texts behind locked doors. Some even believe the church adopted parts of this magic and rebranded it. Latin became the new sacred language. Prayers had to be said in exact patterns. Chanting became ritual. Silence became power. And while the church warned the public about magical speech, it used those same rhythms behind the altar because deep down they knew the Egyptians were right. Words change things. Even today, you can feel it. The way a sentence can make your skin tingle, the way a song lyric can stick in your head for days, the way a single name can break a heart or bring someone to life in your memory. It's not superstition, it's connection, it's intention, and it's old. Maybe that's why the church feared it, not because it wasn't real, but because it was. The Egyptians believed that when you speak with purpose, you tap into something larger than yourself, something timeless, something sacred. And once you know that, you can never unlearn it. The truth is, words are still magic. They always were. There's a spell in the Egyptian Book of the Dead that sounds like something pulled straight from a church sermon. It speaks of a soul rising, of a body reawakening, of light breaking through darkness. But it wasn't written by Christians. It was carved into tomb walls over 1,000 years before the first gospel was ever whispered. And once people started translating it, things got uncomfortable fast.
Sound familiar? To scholars who read it for the first time, it felt like déjà vu. The parallels to early Christian resurrection stories were too strong to ignore. But that raised a troubling question. How could Egyptian priests have described the resurrection of the dead in such detail long before Christianity ever existed? The church didn't have a good answer, so for a long time they avoided it. Translations of the Book of the Dead were limited. Some pages were left out of published editions. Museums quietly locked away fragments that referenced rebirth or eternal life. And the resurrection spell, known today as Spell 168, became something you only talked about in whispers. But eventually, the truth got out. It became clear that Egypt had its own version of Judgment Day, that Osiris, the god who died and rose again, shared more than a few traits with another well-known figure, that even the symbolism of crossing the river, being washed clean and stepping into light, had ancient Egyptian roots. The idea of resurrection wasn't born in a cave in Jerusalem. It was carved in stone along the Nile, and that made people uncomfortable. Not because it disproved anything, but because it suggested that Christianity might not have invented the story of rebirth. It may have inherited it, refined it, reframed it for a new audience, but the seed was already there, growing for centuries in temple walls and scrolls. The church couldn't ban the Book of the Dead outright, but it could downplay it, turn it into myth, pretend it was all metaphor. And for a while that worked. But now we're looking back. We're translating with fresh eyes, and what we're finding is that the resurrection spell doesn't clash with Christian belief, it mirrors it. Which leads to a haunting thought. Maybe the story was never about one religion. Maybe the idea of dying and returning, of being judged and reborn, is older than any book. Maybe it's something deep inside us, a truth whispered again and again in different tongues. And Egypt just happened to write it down first. Most people think alchemy is just about turning metal into gold. Old bearded men in dusty rooms mixing strange powders hoping to get rich. But in ancient Egypt, alchemy was something much deeper. It wasn't just about gold. It was about the soul. Egyptian priests believed that everything in the universe had layers: physical, mental, spiritual. To change one, you had to understand all three. So when they talked about transforming lead into gold, they weren't only talking about metal. They were talking about people, about turning the heavy, dull parts of a person into something pure, bright, and eternal. It was a kind of inner science. The symbols of alchemy, the sun, the serpent, and the lotus, weren't just tools. They were stages of transformation. Lead was the beginning, a state of darkness, of ignorance. Gold was the end, a state of light, full awareness, enlightenment. In their rituals, Egyptian mystics used colors, chants, and even specific smells to mimic these stages inside the body. The goal wasn't wealth, it was rebirth. And this made the early church very uncomfortable because it gave people a path to the divine that didn't need priests. You didn't need to be baptized or go to confession. You just needed to look inward, to refine yourself, to burn away what was false and become something new.
That kind of power was dangerous in the wrong hands. So the church labeled alchemy as pagan, then heretical, then forbidden, but not forgotten. Behind closed doors, Christian mystics quietly studied old Egyptian texts. Some even borrowed from them. The idea of purifying the soul, of going through fire to reach heaven, shows up again and again in Christian writings, but the connection to Egypt was erased on purpose. Alchemy became a joke in the public eye, a failed science, a fairy tale. But that's not how it started. In fact, the word alchemy itself comes from the Egyptian word chem, meaning black earth, the rich soil of the Nile, the place where life begins. The Greeks added al when they took the knowledge and passed it through the Islamic world. By the time it reached medieval Europe, the original meaning was almost gone. But the secrets were still there, hidden in symbols, disguised in code. Some believe the final goal of Egyptian alchemy was not just to change the soul, but to activate something dormant, a spark inside the body that could awaken higher senses, vision beyond the ordinary, energy that could bend reality. And if that sounds like magic, maybe that's the point. Maybe the greatest treasure Egypt offered wasn't gold. It was a process, a map, a way back to yourself. So the next time you hear about alchemists searching for gold, remember they weren't just chasing wealth. They were chasing light. They were chasing truth. And the church wasn't afraid they'd succeed in getting rich. They were afraid they'd succeed in waking up.
Imagine standing in a candlelit tomb, surrounded by walls covered in ancient symbols. A priest leans over the mummy of someone once powerful. In his hand is a tool carved from sacred stone. He raises it gently and touches the lips of the dead, not to mourn, but to awaken. This was the opening of the mouth, one of the most sacred rituals in ancient Egypt and one of the most feared by the church. The Egyptians believed death wasn't the end. It was a passage. But to pass through it, you needed your senses, your eyes to see, your ears to hear, your mouth to speak. Without speech, the soul would be lost. It couldn't say its name. It couldn't defend itself in the afterlife. It couldn't call out to the gods. So the priests performed a powerful rite. They restored the voice of the dead. It wasn't a metaphor. They believed it literally worked. The ritual involved chants, incense, special instruments, and sacred texts. It could take hours, sometimes days. The body was treated like a sleeping god. The mouth was opened with precision. And the final words spoken during the rite weren't just prayers. They were commands. Rise, speak, remember. To the Egyptians, it was an act of compassion, of love, of magic. But to the Vatican, it was something else entirely. When early Christian scholars first read about the opening of the mouth, they panicked. The idea of restoring speech after death sounded like necromancy. Speaking with the dead was a huge sin in the eyes of the church. Only God was supposed to have power over life and death. And here was a ritual thousands of years old claiming to do just that. So they called it satanic. They said the priests were summoning demons, that the ritual was a doorway to the underworld, that it was proof the Egyptians worshipped false gods. The Vatican banned translations of the ritual. Any European scholar who studied it risked exile. Some early Egyptologists were even accused of heresy for writing about it. And in public sermons, the ritual was held up as an example of pagan darkness. But was that really the reason? Or was it something deeper? Because if the Egyptians could restore a voice, even symbolically, it meant they had knowledge. Knowledge about life, memory, the soul. And it didn't come from Christian doctrine. It came from somewhere older, somewhere the church couldn't control. That's what made it dangerous. Not because it was evil, but because it worked. Today, we understand that the opening of the mouth was part of a larger spiritual science, a way of helping the soul move on, a way of keeping the past alive through spoken word.
And maybe that's what the church feared most, that voices are power, and if the dead could speak, maybe they would tell stories no one wanted to hear, stories about what came before the Bible, before Rome, before silence became sacred. And that, to the Vatican, was the real threat. Long before Latin hymns echoed in cathedrals, before crosses stood over temples, there was a figure with the head of an ibis and the knowledge of the gods. His name was Thoth. To the ancient Egyptians, Thoth wasn't just a god. He was the mind behind magic, the keeper of time, the writer of all spells. And his followers, the priests of Thoth, were trusted with something most people were never meant to see: the raw language of creation. These weren't ordinary priests. They weren't just leading ceremonies or blessing crops. They were scholars, scribes, mystics. They worked in secret chambers surrounded by scrolls and symbols. Their job was to record divine knowledge and protect it. They believed that words could shape reality, that writing something down the right way could bend the laws of nature. And for centuries, they passed that knowledge from one generation to another, hidden in layers of symbols, poetry, and song. But then came a new religion, one that didn't like competition. As Christianity rose, the church began to hunt anything that hinted at other powers, and the spells of Thoth were full of them. Incantations to call back the dead, maps of the stars that predicted events centuries in advance, rituals that claimed to unlock visions and awaken hidden parts of the mind. To the church, it was all sorcery, heresy, a threat to the authority of one single book. So the purge began. Scrolls were burned, temples were destroyed, the names of Thoth's priests were scratched off tomb walls. The church labeled them servants of darkness. Some early Christian writers even claimed Thoth himself was a demon in disguise. But not everything was lost. Some of the priests saw what was coming. They disguised their teachings in Greek, buried texts in desert caves, passed secrets along in whispered riddles. Parts of their wisdom slipped into the writings of later philosophers and mystics. Some even say early alchemists were using fragments of Thoth's teachings without even knowing it. His presence never fully disappeared. It just went underground, and the Vatican knew it. In secret libraries beneath Rome, locked behind iron doors, are documents that mention Thoth by name, spells written in ancient Coptic, star charts that don't match any modern system, pages so old they crumble when touched. The church didn't destroy everything. Some things they kept, maybe to study, maybe to control, but definitely not to share. Because here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. The priests of Thoth believed that knowledge was divine, that learning was a form of worship, that curiosity could lead you closer to the gods. And the church feared that, because if people could discover truth on their own, what would they need priests for? So the priests of Thoth were erased from history, not because they were wrong, but because they remembered too much. Look up at the night sky. To us, it's just stars, distant suns, random lights scattered in the dark. But to the ancient Egyptians, it was a map, a living code. They didn't just look at the stars, they listened to the stars. They believed the sky spoke in patterns. And one of the oldest and most powerful symbols in that cosmic language was the serpent. In ancient Egyptian temples, you'll find snakes carved into ceilings, slithering through the sky next to constellations and planets. These weren't just decorations, they were instructions. The serpent represented energy, flow, transformation. It moved between worlds, between life and death, earth and sky, physical and spiritual. and when combined with certain stars, that snake became a tool.
Egyptian priests used this knowledge in their magical rites. They aligned rituals with specific constellations. They whispered names of stars during healing spells. They built temples to mirror the heavens. Some chambers were designed so that once a year, during a specific celestial event, a beam of starlight would fall on a statue or altar. That moment wasn't just symbolic, it was power. The sky was charging the ritual. And the church didn't like that one bit. See, early Christianity taught that God was separate from the stars, that worshiping the heavens was pagan, dangerous, blasphemous. So any Egyptian texts that talked about astrology, cosmic timing, or serpent symbols were either hidden or destroyed. Star maps were declared heretical, and serpent magic was renamed serpent worship, twisted into something evil. But the truth is, Egyptian serpent and star rituals weren't about worshiping snakes or bowing to planets. They were about tuning in. The priests believed the universe was alive, that everything moved with purpose, and that by understanding those patterns, you could align yourself with something bigger, heal faster, think clearer, even unlock hidden parts of the soul. And that idea, that human beings could access divine power without permission, was terrifying to a church that wanted control. So the Vatican erased it, or tried to, but bits survived. Some of the earliest Christian symbols secretly carried this knowledge. The serpent on the cross, the halo of stars around Mary, even the timing of major holidays like Christmas, aligned with solstice patterns, shows traces of old star rites hidden in plain sight. Today, scientists are discovering that ancient Egyptian astronomy was incredibly advanced. They tracked Sirius with such accuracy it still baffles modern researchers. They built entire calendars based on star cycles. But what they didn't write down, what they only passed from priest to priest in ritual, was how those stars made them feel. What they saw during those moments of perfect alignment. What they feared. What they awakened. Maybe some of it was symbolic. Maybe some of it was real. But one thing's certain, the Egyptians weren't just watching the stars, they were speaking with them. And the Vatican, sitting under its own dome of painted skies, is still not ready to admit how much those voices once said. Open a Bible and read the stories. A baby hidden in a basket, a God who dies and returns, water turned into blood, plagues of darkness. These are things we think of as purely biblical. But if you go back far enough, past the Latin, past the Greek, past even the Hebrew, you'll find something unexpected. You'll find Egypt. Long before the Bible was written, Egyptian myths were already being told. Stories about gods who walked the earth, about divine births and cosmic floods, about magic words that shaped the world. These weren't fairy tales to them. They were memory, history, instruction. And for thousands of years, these stories were recorded on scrolls, not just on tomb walls or temple pillars, but in delicate books written on papyrus, kept safe in libraries most of the world never saw. Then something changed. As early Christianity spread, it began absorbing parts of older traditions. Some were adapted, some were renamed, some were rewritten so completely you'd never recognize their roots unless you knew what to look for. But it's there. Take the story of Horus. He's born from the goddess Isis, after she gathers the scattered body of her husband, Osiris. He's a child of miraculous birth, protected by divine forces. He grows up to battle darkness and restore order. That story existed over 1,000 years before the Gospels. But the structure feels familiar. Too familiar. Or look at Moses, raised in Egypt, speaking to pharaohs, holding a staff that turns into a serpent, parting waters. These are not just narrative choices, they're fingerprints.
echoes of Egyptian magic and myth reshaped for a new audience. But this wasn't just borrowing. It was a kind of transformation. Egyptian ideas weren't copied word for word. They were folded into a new religion, then used to build its foundation. And as the Bible became more powerful, the original myths had to disappear quietly, carefully, so that no one would ask questions. The church didn't want people comparing texts, didn't want scholars pointing out that the Ten Commandments shared structure with the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or that the concept of a final judgment had already been described in the Hall of Ma'at, where the heart of the dead was weighed against a feather. So Egypt was painted as a land of idols, of false gods, of lost souls. Its scrolls were labeled heresy, its stories turned into warnings. And yet the roots remained. Even today, when you look closely at certain parables or psalms, you can feel the rhythm of an older language beneath them, a language shaped by Nile priests and sun temples, a language that once described the soul as eternal and the universe as alive. The Bible didn't come from nowhere. It came through time, through people, through scrolls that once sat in Egyptian hands. And while the church tried to silence the origin, the echoes never fully faded. You just have to know where to listen. Right in the middle of St. Peter's Square, surrounded by marble columns and millions of tourists each year, stands something that doesn't quite belong. It's not a cross. It's not a statue of a saint. It's a 4,000-year-old Egyptian obelisk, and it didn't start its journey in Rome. It came from Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Once it stood in a temple dedicated to Ra, the sun god. Now it casts its shadow over the heart of the Vatican.
Most people don't even notice it. They walk past it, take selfies near it, maybe wonder why it's there. But the truth is stranger than most would guess. Because this obelisk isn't just decoration, it's a message, a memory, a relic of a time when Egypt held the secrets of the stars and the soul. And the Vatican didn't just steal it, they planted it in their most sacred space, right on top of something hidden. The obelisk arrived in Rome long before Christianity rose to power. Roman emperors brought it back as a trophy, a symbol of conquest. But when Christianity became the dominant religion, instead of tearing it down, the church kept it, moved it, protected it. And then, during the 1500s, something strange happened. They dug under it. They realigned it. They performed a secret ceremony before raising it again. And after that, the square was redesigned around it. Why? Some believe it's just art, a piece of history on display. But others think differently. Obelisks were not just monuments. They were spiritual antennas. In ancient Egypt, they were believed to connect Earth to the heavens. Placed at temple entrances, they drew in cosmic energy and divine light. The tip was often covered in gold to catch the sun's rays. They marked sacred geometry, ritual power. So what happens when you plant one right in the center of Christianity's most powerful location, and what lies beneath it? There are rumors, whispers among historians and researchers that under the Vatican's obelisk is a sealed vault, that before it was moved, church engineers discovered something buried beneath. Not Roman, not Christian, Egyptian. Some say it's a hidden chamber from when Rome still followed ancient rites. Others believe it contains scrolls, maybe even one of the lost books of Thoth. The Vatican has never commented. No one is allowed to excavate the area. All official documents related to the move are vague. What's clear is this. The church went through an enormous effort to keep that obelisk standing, perfectly centered, perfectly aligned. And maybe it's because, deep down, they know what it means, that Christianity didn't erase Egypt. It built on top of it, stone by stone, symbol by symbol, until only the obelisk remained to tell the truth, standing tall, pointing up, waiting. Because even buried under centuries of silence, some memories still rise toward the light. Most people think censorship is something that happens in movies or books, something that only belongs to dictators or governments afraid of bad press. But what if I told you that one of the most powerful bans in history didn't target politics or rebellion? It targeted translation. A quiet decree buried in church archives, still active today. And its goal was simple: make sure certain Egyptian texts were never read again. It's called the Seal of Silence. Not many people know about it. That's the point. Issued by a pope hundreds of years ago, the order wasn't shouted from the rooftops. It wasn't meant for the public. It was whispered to bishops, scholars, and archivists. A list of forbidden manuscripts, writings that, if translated or copied, could lead to excommunication or worse. And guess what showed up on that list? Egyptian texts. Not just any texts, specific ones. Magical papyri, astronomical scrolls, fragments of the so-called books of Thoth that spoke of hidden laws of nature, of resurrection rituals, of divine geometry and memory. These weren't just myths to the people who wrote them. They were tools. And to the Vatican, they were threats. The Church had a problem. For centuries, it controlled knowledge. It told people which stories mattered, which ones were holy, and which ones were lies. But the Egyptian scrolls didn't follow the script. They talked about gods who weren't gods anymore, about souls that moved through stargates, about magic that wasn't evil, but divine. And worst of all, some of these ideas echoed Christian doctrine, but from a time long before Christianity existed. So the decision was made: silence it all. At first this was easy. Most people couldn't read hieroglyphs. The language had been dead for over 1,000 years. But in the 1800s, when scholars like Champollion began to crack the code, alarms went off. Suddenly, dusty papyri weren't just museum pieces, they were readable. And some of them started talking. That's when the Seal of Silence came back into play. Church-approved translators were given strict guidelines. Some texts were deemed too dangerous to publish in full. Others were buried in footnotes or quietly mislabeled. Independent scholars who pushed too far found their work discredited or mysteriously blocked from publication. Libraries held restricted sections that required special permission to enter, and the seal still quietly attached to certain documents. Why go to so much effort? Because the Church feared what these texts could unlock. Not monsters or demons, but ideas, questions, possibilities. That maybe our history wasn't as clean as it seemed. That maybe the roots of Christianity weren't only in Jerusalem, but in Memphis, in Thebes, in the temples of Egypt, where priests once spoke to stars and called it prayer. The Seal of Silence isn't just about words, it's about control. And as long as it stays in place, the past remains a whisper, one we're still not supposed to hear.
In the 1600s, while Europe argued over theology and power, a small group of men boarded a ship bound for Egypt. They wore simple robes, carried crucifixes, and spoke in whispers. Officially, they were missionaries. But their mission wasn't about converting anyone. It was about uncovering something buried in the sands, something the Church had been watching for centuries. These men were Jesuits, and this was the expedition no one was ever supposed to talk about. There are only fragments of the story left. A few letters tucked inside old Vatican archives, a shipping manifest with erased names, and a single report written in code, sealed, and never published. But from what survives, a picture begins to form. The Jesuits had a secret objective. They weren't heading to the pyramids or the tourist spots. They were going deep into Upper Egypt, places that didn't appear on most maps, places where locals still whispered about gods that weren't supposed to exist anymore. These priests had maps older than the Renaissance. They had sketches of ruined temples no European had supposedly ever seen.
And most importantly, they had orders. Find the lost library. Not the Library of Alexandria. That was long gone, burned, looted, erased. But legend said that before it was destroyed, certain texts had been smuggled out, carried by priests into the desert, hidden in underground chambers, guarded by riddles and symbols, books not just of philosophy or astronomy, but of magic, of resurrection, of ancient rites so powerful, even speaking them could change something in you. The Jesuits believed the vault was real, and some say they found it. There are clues. One journal entry talks about a staircase beneath a collapsed temple. Another mentions blackened stone walls etched with carvings no one could translate. And then there's the gap, a full month of missing entries. When the journal resumes, the tone is different, fearful, urgent. One phrase repeats again and again: "We must not bring it back." Whatever they saw, whatever they read, it changed them. Not long after, they abandoned the mission. Some returned to Europe, but others disappeared completely. The church officially denied the expedition ever happened. The few documents that remained were locked away. When scholars later tried to trace the journey, they hit dead ends, burned records, missing maps, vanished names. Why? Because the Jesuits had seen something the Vatican couldn't control. Knowledge that didn't bow to doctrine. Symbols that matched visions in early Christian texts. Spells that mirrored sacraments. A blueprint for the soul that didn't require a church. So the expedition was erased. Not forgotten, just hidden. But every now and then, a letter surfaces, a coded map appears in an auction house, a strange symbol shows up in a Jesuit seminary, and people start asking again, what did they really find out there? And why is the silence louder than any sermon? They looked harmless, heads bowed in prayer, robes dragging across stone floors, hands stained with ink from copying scriptures. The monks of old were seen as peaceful, devoted, and silent. But what no one tells you is that some of them were also spies. Monasteries weren't just places of worship, they were information hubs. In a world where most people couldn't read, the monks were the ones who held the keys to knowledge. And with those keys came power. The kind of power that didn't need swords or armies, just silence and ink. Every monastery had a scriptorium, a room where texts were copied by hand. But not every text was copied faithfully. I found documents with entire paragraphs scratched out, entire pages replaced. A monk once confessed in an old letter that he was ordered to remove certain names from history, rewrite events, change dates. Not because they were false, but because they didn't serve the church's version of truth. Monks traveled too, quietly, under the guise of pilgrimage or service. But they returned with more than just prayers. They brought news, gossip from courts, reports of strange teachings, warnings about heretics. They acted as the church's eyes and ears across the continent. Long before governments had anything close to an intelligence network, the church had monks. If a village was building a strange machine, or a scholar was teaching ideas that didn't line up with doctrine, chances are a monk would hear about it first. Then the message would make its way up the chain. Sometimes the result was a quiet visit from a higher priest, sometimes a public trial. Sometimes the records simply vanished. But the most dangerous monks were the ones who could read Egyptian. In the dark corners of monasteries, hidden behind false walls or buried in wine cellars, were scrolls and papyri that had been smuggled out of Egypt centuries earlier. These weren't supposed to exist. The church had officially banned all Egyptian magical texts. But some monks couldn't bring themselves to destroy knowledge. even forbidden knowledge, so they hid it. And sometimes, late at night, when no one was watching, they studied it. These monks learned things they weren't supposed to know. Egyptian spells for healing that worked better than prayer, astronomical calculations more accurate than church-approved calendars, maps of the soul's journey through death that didn't match Christian teaching. And slowly, quietly, some of this knowledge began to seep into Christian practice. Not openly, not officially, but in whispered conversations, in private rituals, in symbols carved into the hidden corners of cathedrals where only the builders would ever see them. The Vatican knew this was happening. How do we know? Because they kept records. Files on monks suspected of Egyptian sympathies, reports of strange rituals conducted in remote monasteries, letters from abbots warning about brothers who spent too much time with unholy texts. Some monks were transferred to different locations. Others simply disappeared. But the knowledge never fully went away. It just went deeper underground. And sometimes when you know what to look for, you can still find traces of it. Egyptian symbols carved into monastery walls, star charts that don't match Western astronomy, rituals that feel familiar but don't quite belong to any Christian tradition. The monks weren't just copying scriptures. Some of them were copying spells. And the Church, for all its power, could never completely stop them. Tucked away in one of the darker corners of the Vatican Library is a scroll that doesn't belong. It's not a Bible, it's not Latin, and it's not supposed to exist. It's drawn on faded parchment, covered in symbols that even some scholars can't fully explain. But what makes it strange isn't just what's on it, it's what's not. This map shows Egypt, but not the Egypt we know, not the Egypt you'll see on Google Earth. This is a map of temples that don't appear on any modern record. And the question is, why? The scroll first came to light in the 1800s, buried inside a sealed Jesuit archive. It was found alongside a journal written in a ciphered dialect of Coptic and Latin. Most dismissed it as a curiosity, a fake maybe. But one monk, who specialized in ancient cartography, began to study it. What he found sent ripples through the inner circle of the Church.
The landmarks were familiar at first. The Nile, the Valley of the Kings, even the pyramids, although drawn smaller than expected. But then, as the map continued south, things changed. Entire temple complexes were labeled with names that matched no known site. There were markers where modern ruins do not exist, arrows pointing to locations beneath sand dunes. And most strange of all, certain spots were circled in red ink with a single word scrawled in the margin: Silare, Latin for be silent. Why would the Church keep a map like this? One theory is that these weren't just temples. They were sanctuaries, places where ancient Egyptian priests conducted rituals so secret that even the pharaohs didn't speak of them openly. These weren't tourist sites or tombs. They were repositories for scrolls, for knowledge, for spells that dealt with the movement of stars and the architecture of the soul, the kind of things early Christian scribes called dangerous. The red circles seem to confirm it. Every circled location corresponds with an ancient tale or fragment found in forbidden texts. A temple of mirrors said to reflect divine truth, a buried hall that supposedly housed the body of a god-king who never died, a sanctuary said to have been built with sound, not stone. When modern archaeologists attempted to visit some of the locations, they found nothing. Empty desert, flat land. But that didn't stop the rumors. Satellite imaging later revealed strange patterns beneath the surface. Foundations, grid shapes, things too precise to be natural. But when permission was requested to excavate, doors closed. The Egyptian government denied access. Vatican scholars offered no help, and the map, it vanished back into the archives, except copies were made, illegally, quietly. And now a few researchers are following those paths, not to dig, but to listen, to feel, to stand where memory still lingers in stone and sand. Because maybe the map isn't just about finding lost temples. Maybe it's about finding what the church was afraid they would teach. It started with a collapsed tunnel. A minor earthquake in Rome had opened a crack in one of the lesser-known catacombs beneath the city. Workers were sent to assess the damage. What they found wasn't just broken stone. It was a sealed chamber, one that no record showed, hidden behind layers of dirt and forgotten prayers. And inside that chamber was something that shouldn't have been there. A sarcophagus decorated in gold leaf, carved with symbols that weren't Latin or Christian. They were Egyptian. The Vatican sealed the site within hours. What happened next was kept off the books. No official statement, no press release, but some details leaked, enough to piece together the story. The sarcophagus was opened under supervision. Inside was a body, perfectly preserved, mummified, wrapped in linens that bore the mark of royalty. Whoever he was, this wasn't some stolen corpse from a museum or black market. He had been placed there deliberately, buried beneath Rome, just a few steps from the oldest Christian crypts. The body showed signs of extreme care, the kind of preparation reserved for pharaohs. Organs removed, resin used, amulets placed over the chest. But the strange part wasn't just the condition of the body, it was the objects buried with it. A scroll case containing fragments of hieratic script, a dagger inlaid with lapis lazuli and inscribed with prayers to Thoth, and a small statue of Osiris, god of the dead, clutched in the mummy's hands. Why would a pharaoh be buried beneath a Christian city? One theory is that he wasn't buried there at all, that he was hidden, smuggled, taken from Egypt during one of the early Crusades or Jesuit missions, and placed there beneath the church's feet, not as a trophy, but as a secret. Some think he was a priest, not a king, a keeper of forbidden rites, a man who knew spells that blurred the line between resurrection and reincarnation.
And the scroll fragments seem to support that. They mention a bridge of breath and a gate of stars beneath the black sun, phrases that match language found in the Book of the Dead. And oddly enough, in a few early Christian texts that were later removed from the Bible. Others believe the burial was part of a pact, a deal struck between early church fathers and rogue Egyptian priests, a trade of silence for power, a merging of symbols. After all, many of the early catacombs use imagery that looks suspiciously Egyptian. Winged figures, eyes watching from behind, sun discs, snakes forming halos. But if that's true, then why hide the body? Because proof is dangerous. Proof that Egyptian rites didn't just survive, they were honored, hidden beneath the seed of Christianity itself. That magic and resurrection were not opposites, but overlapping ideas. And that maybe, just maybe, the Vatican's greatest fear wasn't the dead man himself, it was what he might remember. In dusty monasteries lit by candlelight, monks copied scripture by hand, hour after hour, word after word. Every letter had to be perfect. A single mistake meant starting over. Most people imagine these monks as quiet, obedient men just preserving the Word of God. But some of them were doing something else. Hidden between the lines of Psalms and Gospels, they were slipping in magic, spells, symbols, forbidden names. Not on the surface, but in the margins, in invisible ink, in code. They were writing two books at once. Scholars call them glosses, tiny notes scribbled on the edges of manuscripts. Most were innocent, a translation, a comment, but a few were strange. They referenced Egyptian gods by name. They described rituals for summoning angels. They hinted at secret knowledge passed down from the temples of Thoth. One margin even included a spell from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, rewritten using Christian terms. The prayer looked like it was about Jesus, but the structure and symbols matched a much older rite. Why would monks do this? Because not all of them agreed with the church. Some had studied in places like Alexandria. Some had access to ancient texts before they were burned. They believed knowledge was sacred, no matter where it came from, and when they were ordered to destroy it, they chose to hide it instead. They disguised Egyptian spells as Christian prayers. They buried magical formulas inside Bible verses. They encoded names of old gods inside Latin acrostics. On the surface, everything looked holy, but underneath was something else. A shadow library, a parallel tradition, Egyptian wisdom wrapped in Christian language. The church knew this was happening. How do we know? Because they kept looking. Vatican inspectors would arrive at monasteries unannounced, demanding to see manuscripts. Any monk found with suspicious marginalia faced interrogation. Some were reassigned. Others were punished. A few simply vanished. But the practice never stopped completely. It just got more creative. Monks developed codes so sophisticated that modern scholars are still trying to crack them. They used multiple languages in single sentences. They hid messages in the spacing between words. They even embedded spells in the decoration itself, in the curves of illuminated letters, in the patterns of vine scrolls that seemed purely ornamental. Some of these manuscripts still exist, tucked away in cathedral libraries, displayed in museums as examples of medieval art. Most people see them as beautiful but harmless religious texts. They don't realize they're looking at spell books, Egyptian magic hidden in plain sight, preserved for centuries by monks who couldn't bear to let ancient wisdom die. The Vatican tried to purge this shadow tradition, but they never quite succeeded. Because you can't destroy an idea by burning books. You can only drive it underground. And underground, Egyptian magic survived, copied by candlelight, whispered in Latin, disguised as prayer. The monks weren't just preserving Christian scripture. They were preserving the knowledge that Christianity had tried to erase. And maybe that's the most rebellious act of all, refusing to let the past die, even when powerful men insist it must.
The year was 1460. In a monastery near Florence, a young monk named Cosimo de' Medici's agent had just purchased a collection of ancient Greek manuscripts from Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire had fallen, and scholars were fleeing west with whatever texts they could carry. Among the scrolls was something that would send shockwaves through the Vatican. The complete works of Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary Egyptian sage whose teachings had been lost for over 1,000 years. But these weren't just philosophical treatises. They were instruction manuals, step-by-step guides to Egyptian magic, divine communication, and the transformation of the human soul. The Renaissance was about to collide with the ancient world, and the Catholic Church was about to face its greatest crisis since the fall of Rome. The Hermetic texts, as they became known, claimed to be the original source of all divine wisdom. Written by Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, they described a universe where human beings could become gods through knowledge and spiritual practice. Man was not a fallen creature in need of salvation, but a divine being who had simply forgotten his true nature. It was the opposite of everything Christianity taught, and it was spreading like wildfire through Renaissance Italy. Marsilio Ficino, the brilliant scholar commissioned to translate the texts, realized immediately what he was dealing with. These weren't just ancient documents. They were a complete alternative to Christian doctrine, a religion without sin, without priests, without the need for institutional salvation. The individual human soul could ascend to divinity through knowledge, meditation, and the proper use of natural forces. The Vatican's counterattack would reshape the course of Western history. But first, they had to understand exactly what they were fighting against. The man who would define the Church's response to Egyptian magic was Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, one of the most brilliant theologians of the Counter-Reformation. Bellarmine had been tasked with studying the Hermetic texts and developing a theological refutation that would destroy their credibility once and for all. But as Bellarmine delved deeper into the ancient Egyptian teachings, something unexpected happened. He began to find uncomfortable parallels between Hermetic philosophy and Christian mysticism. The Egyptian concept of divine transformation through knowledge resembled the teachings of Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart and Johannes Tauler. The Hermetic practice of contemplative union with God was virtually identical to what Christian contemplatives had been doing for centuries. Most disturbing of all, Bellarmine discovered that many early Christian writers had been directly influenced by Hermetic teachings. The Gospel of John's opening verses about the divine Logos bore striking similarities to Hermetic texts about the creative Word. The writings of early Church Fathers, like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, contained obvious borrowings from Egyptian philosophy. Bellarmine faced an impossible choice. If he acknowledged the parallels between Hermetism and Christianity, he would validate Egyptian magic and undermine the Church's claims to unique revelation. If he denied the connections, he would have to explain away obvious similarities that any educated reader could see. His solution was brilliant and dishonest in equal measure. In his famous Disputations of 1586, Bellarmine argued that the Hermetic texts were not authentic ancient documents at all, but medieval forgeries created by Islamic scholars to seduce Christians away from the true faith. The similarities between Egyptian and Christian teachings existed because Islamic forgers had deliberately copied Christian ideas and attributed them to ancient Egyptian sages.
It was a masterful piece of propaganda that solved multiple problems at once. It explained away the parallels between Christianity and Hermeticism while portraying Egyptian magic as a satanic deception designed to corrupt the faithful. It also conveniently blamed Muslims for the entire controversy, allowing the Church to redirect religious hatred toward a familiar enemy. But Bellarmine knew he was lying. His private correspondence, discovered in the Vatican's secret archives in the 20th century, reveals his genuine belief that the Hermetic texts were authentic and that Christianity had indeed been influenced by Egyptian teachings. In one letter to a fellow cardinal, he wrote, "We cannot deny the antiquity of these teachings without denying the foundations of our own theology, but neither can we acknowledge them without destroying the authority of the Church." The solution was suppression disguised as scholarship. Bellarmine's refutation became the official Catholic position on Hermeticism, repeated by theologians for the next 4 centuries. Egyptian magic was dismissed as medieval fraud, and anyone who suggested otherwise was labeled a heretic. But the texts themselves couldn't be destroyed. They had spread too widely, been copied too many times. All the Church could do was control how they were interpreted and hope that future generations would accept Bellarmine's whys as historical fact. While the Vatican fought a public war against Hermetic philosophy, it was simultaneously waging a secret campaign to acquire and study Egyptian magical texts. If Egyptian magic was dangerous enough to ban, it was valuable enough to steal. And if it couldn't be destroyed, it needed to be controlled. The man chosen to lead this covert operation was Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, grandson of Pope Paul III and one of the wealthiest collectors in Europe. Farnese had unlimited funds, extensive diplomatic connections, and a network of agents throughout the Mediterranean world. His official mission was to acquire classical manuscripts for the Vatican Library. His unofficial mission was to find and secure every Egyptian magical text that could be located. Farnese's agents operated like a combination of scholars and spies. They haunted the libraries of Constantinople, Alexandria, and Cairo, offering enormous sums for any papyrus of parchments that contained Egyptian magical instructions. They cultivated relationships with Muslim and Jewish scholars who had access to texts forbidden to Christians. They even arranged for the theft of manuscripts from rival collections when negotiation failed. The operation was stunningly successful. Between 1550 and 1600, Farnese's network acquired over 300 Egyptian magical texts, including complete copies of the books of Thoth, the Leiden Papyrus, and the Stockholm Papyrus, some of the most powerful spell collections ever created. All of these texts were secretly transported to Rome and locked away in a special vault beneath the Vatican Library. But Farnese wasn't just collecting these texts, he was studying them, and what he learned would change his understanding of Christianity forever. The Egyptian magical texts revealed a sophisticated system of spiritual development that predated Christianity by thousands of years. They described techniques for achieving divine consciousness, communicating with spiritual beings, and manipulating natural forces through focused intention and ritual practice. Most remarkably, they worked. Farnese began experimenting with Egyptian magical practices in the privacy of his palace. He constructed ritual chambers based on ancient temple designs. He learned to read hieroglyphic spells and perform traditional Egyptian ceremonies. And he experienced visions, healings, and supernatural phenomena that convinced him that Egyptian magic was not only real but superior to Christian mysticism. His transformation was noticed by other members of the Vatican hierarchy. Cardinals who had known Farnese as a conventional church politician began to see him as something else entirely. He spoke of direct communication with divine forces. He demonstrated knowledge of future events. He seemed to possess powers that no Christian saint had ever displayed. Pope Clement VIII became suspicious of Farnese's activities and ordered a secret investigation. What the papal investigators discovered horrified them. Farnese had not only been practicing Egyptian magic, he had been teaching it to a select circle of cardinals, bishops, and wealthy lay people. The highest levels of the Catholic Church had been infiltrated by Egyptian priests in Christian robes. The scandal was suppressed, but the damage was done. The Vatican's secret war against Egyptian magic had backfired spectacularly. Instead of controlling the threat, they had proven its reality. Instead of destroying Egyptian wisdom, they had validated its power. And instead of protecting Christianity from pagan influence, they had shown that ancient Egyptian magic was more effective than Christian prayer.
Clement VIII faced the same impossible choice that had confronted his predecessors: acknowledge the reality of Egyptian magic and undermine Christian doctrine, or suppress the evidence and hope that the truth never emerged. He chose suppression. Farnese was quietly transferred to a remote monastery, where he died under mysterious circumstances 6 months later. His collection of Egyptian texts was sealed in the deepest vaults of the Vatican, never to be opened again. The cardinals who had been involved in his magical circle were scattered to distant posts or eliminated entirely. But the knowledge couldn't be killed. It had already spread beyond the Vatican's control, carried by Farnese's students into noble courts and secret societies across Europe. Egyptian magic had survived the Church's greatest efforts to destroy it, and it was about to emerge in forms that would challenge Christianity for centuries to come. In the shadows of the Catholic Church's public theology, a different kind of Christianity was emerging,
one that incorporated Egyptian magical practices, acknowledged the reality of multiple paths to divinity, and treated the institutional church as just one option among many for spiritual development. These secret Christians didn't reject Jesus or the Bible. They simply placed them within a larger context of ancient wisdom that included Egyptian, Greek, and Jewish mystical traditions. The most famous of these Christian Hermetists was Giordano Bruno, the brilliant philosopher and former Dominican monk who would eventually be burned at the stake for his beliefs. Bruno argued that Christianity was just the latest version of an ancient religion that had been taught in Egyptian temples for thousands of years. Jesus was a great teacher, but so were Hermes Trismegistus, Moses, and Buddha. All religions were different expressions of the same underlying truth about the divine nature of human consciousness. Bruno's synthesis of Christianity and Egyptian magic was seductive and dangerous. It offered all the spiritual benefits of religious faith without the institutional control of organized religion. It promised direct access to divine power through individual practice rather than priestly mediation. And it suggested that the Catholic Church's claims to exclusive salvation were not only false, but harmful to human spiritual development. The Vatican's response to Bruno was swift and brutal. He was arrested by the Roman Inquisition in 1592, imprisoned for 8 years, and finally burned alive in 1600 when he refused to recant his beliefs. But his execution only proved the power of what he was teaching. The Church was willing to kill to prevent people from learning that Egyptian magic offered a better path to God than Christian doctrine. Bruno's death sent a clear message to other Christian Hermetists: practice in secret or face the flames. And that's exactly what they did. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, underground networks of Christian mages continued to study and practice Egyptian magic while maintaining outward conformity to Catholic doctrine. They met in private homes, communicated through coded letters, and passed down their knowledge through carefully selected students. These secret schools produced some of the most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment. Isaac Newton spent more time studying alchemy and Hermetic philosophy than he did on physics and mathematics. John Dee, the famous advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, was a master of Egyptian magical techniques. Even prominent church leaders like Cardinal Mazarin and Bishop Bossuet privately practiced Hermetic rituals while publicly condemning them as diabolic. The irony was inescapable. The Catholic Church's efforts to suppress Egyptian magic had only made it more attractive. By declaring it forbidden, they had created a mystique that drew the most brilliant minds of Europe. By persecuting its practitioners, they had proven its power. And by driving it underground, they had ensured that it would survive in forms they couldn't control or monitor. Egyptian magic hadn't been destroyed by Christianity. It had been transformed into something new, a secret tradition that combined the mystical techniques of ancient Egypt with the symbolic framework of Christian faith. It was Christianity's shadow, its repressed twin, its hidden potential. And it was growing stronger every day. By 1700, the Vatican realized that their war against Egyptian magic had not only failed, but had created something more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The secret networks of Christian Hermetists had grown into a parallel church, one that offered spiritual power without institutional control, divine knowledge without priestly mediation, and personal transformation without ecclesiastical permission. Even worse, this shadow Christianity was beginning to influence the official church. Bishops who had been exposed to Hermetic ideas were quietly incorporating Egyptian concepts into their theology. Artists were painting Christian subjects using Egyptian symbolic systems. Architects were designing churches according to Hermetic principles. The boundary between Orthodox Christianity and Egyptian magic was becoming increasingly blurred. Pope Innocent XII convened a secret council in 1701 to address what he called the Egyptian crisis. The assembled cardinals acknowledged that traditional methods of suppression had failed and that new strategies were needed. They could no longer simply ban Egyptian texts or execute Egyptian practitioners. The knowledge had spread too widely and taken root too deeply. Instead, they would have to infiltrate the networks of Christian hermetists and destroy them from within. It would be the Vatican's most ambitious covert operation, one that would continue for the next 3 centuries and ultimately shape the modern world's understanding of both Christianity and magic. The war between the Vatican and Egyptian magic was entering its final phase, and the outcome would determine not just the future of Christianity, but the future of human spiritual consciousness itself.
The lodge met at midnight. In the basement of a London tavern, 23 men gathered around an altar decorated with Egyptian hieroglyphs and Masonic symbols. They wore white aprons marked with the Eye of Horus. They carried ritual tools based on ancient Egyptian temple implements. And they practiced ceremonies that combined Christian symbolism with magical techniques older than the pyramids. This was the premier Grand Lodge of England in 1717, the founding moment of modern Freemasonry. But what most people don't know is that Freemasonry wasn't just a fraternal organization. It was the Vatican's worst nightmare made manifest. A secret society that preserved and transmitted Egyptian magical knowledge to the social and political elite of Europe. And the Catholic Church had been watching them for decades. The connection between Freemasonry and Egyptian magic wasn't accidental. Many of the lodge's founding members were scholars, antiquarians, and collectors who had access to Hermetic texts and Egyptian artifacts. They had studied the works of John Dee, Giordano Bruno, and other Christian Hermeticists who had been persecuted by the Inquisition. And they had decided to create a network that could preserve and practice ancient wisdom while remaining hidden from church authorities. The Masonic system was brilliantly designed for this purpose. Its degrees of initiation mirrored the Egyptian temple mysteries, gradually revealing deeper levels of esoteric knowledge to proven candidates. Its symbols were Egyptian in origin, but disguised as architectural metaphors. Its rituals were magical operations, presented as moral teachings. And its membership included kings, prime ministers, and revolutionary leaders who could protect the organization from religious persecution. But the Vatican wasn't fooled. Pope Clement XII issued the first papal condemnation of Freemasonry in 1738, just 21 years after its official founding. The bull In Eminenti declared that Masonic lodges were covers for depraved and perverted religious practices that threatened the authority of the Catholic Church. What Clement XII didn't say publicly was what Vatican investigators had discovered about Masonic rituals. They weren't just meeting to discuss philosophy or plan charitable works. They were performing Egyptian magical operations that produced real supernatural effects. Members were reporting visions of ancient Egyptian gods. They were demonstrating abilities that could only be explained as magical. And they were claiming direct spiritual authority that bypassed the entire Christian ecclesiastical system. The Church's response was swift and comprehensive. Catholic governments throughout Europe were pressured to ban Masonic lodges. Jesuits were ordered to infiltrate existing lodges and report on their activities. And a new branch of the Inquisition was created specifically to combat what Vatican documents called the Egyptian heresy in modern form. But it was too late. Freemasonry had already spread beyond the Church's ability to control it. Lodges were operating in every major European city with members that included some of the most powerful men on the continent. The Egyptian magical tradition that the Vatican had been fighting for over 1,000 years had finally found a form that could survive and flourish in the modern world. The real war
was just beginning. While the Vatican struggled to contain Freemasonry in Europe, an even greater threat was emerging in the Americas. The revolutionary movements that would create the United States were heavily influenced by Masonic ideas about individual liberty, natural rights, and the limitation of religious authority. And at the heart of those ideas were concepts derived from ancient Egyptian political and spiritual philosophy.
The connection wasn't theoretical. Many of the American founding fathers were active Freemasons who had studied Egyptian magical texts and participated in lodge rituals based on ancient temple ceremonies. George Washington was initiated into the Fredericksburg Lodge in Virginia. Benjamin Franklin was a member of multiple lodges and maintained correspondence with European Hermetic scholars. Thomas Jefferson owned one of the largest collections of Egyptian and Hermetic texts in America. These men weren't just influenced by Egyptian ideas, they were consciously attempting to create a society based on Egyptian principles. The separation of church and state reflected the Egyptian understanding that political authority derived from cosmic law rather than priestly interpretation. The emphasis on individual conscience echoed the Egyptian belief that each person had direct access to divine wisdom. Even the architectural symbolism of Washington, D.C. was based on Egyptian temple designs and astronomical alignments. The Vatican recognized the threat immediately. American independence wasn't just a political revolution, it was a spiritual revolution that challenged the entire basis of Christian civilization. For the first time since Constantine, a major nation was being founded on explicitly non-Christian principles derived from Egyptian magical philosophy. Pope Pius VI condemned the American experiment in his encyclical Quod Aliquantum, 1791, warning that religious liberty would lead to the overthrow of the Catholic religion and the triumph of false philosophy. But his condemnation carried little weight in a nation whose leaders had already rejected papal authority in favor of what they called the laws of nature and of nature's God, a phrase lifted directly from Hermetic literature. The success of the American Revolution sent shockwaves through the Catholic Church. If Egyptian magical principles could create a stable and prosperous nation, what did that say about Christian political theory? If individual conscience could replace ecclesiastical authority without leading to chaos, what was the purpose of the priesthood? If natural reason could discover moral truth without revelation, what was the value of Scripture? These questions became even more urgent when the French Revolution erupted in 1789, led by Freemasons, who explicitly proclaimed the triumph of reason over faith and the rights of man over the authority of kings and popes. The Vatican found itself facing not just individual heretics or secret societies, but entire nations that had embraced Egyptian magical worldview as the foundation of their political systems. The age of Christendom was ending, and it was being replaced by something that looked suspiciously like the ancient Egyptian understanding of divine kingship, natural law, and individual spiritual development. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 was officially a military campaign aimed at disrupting British trade routes to India. But for the scholars, artists, and mystics who accompanied the French army, it was something much more significant. The first systematic European exploration of ancient Egyptian civilization since the Roman conquest. Among Napoleon's expedition were 167 scholars who had been tasked with documenting everything they could find about Egyptian history, culture, and religion. What they discovered would revolutionize European understanding of the ancient world and triggered the greatest crisis in the Vatican's ongoing war against Egyptian magic. The scholars found temples and tombs filled with intact Egyptian magical texts, ritual implements, and artistic depictions of magical operations. They deciphered hieroglyphic spells that had been lost for over 1,000 years. They documented astronomical alignments that revealed the sophisticated mathematical and scientific knowledge underlying Egyptian magical practices. And they brought back to Europe thousands of artifacts that proved beyond doubt that Egyptian magic was not primitive superstition, but an advanced spiritual technology.
The publication of the Description de l'Égypte between 1809 and 1829 made this knowledge available to the European public for the first time. Suddenly, educated Europeans could read actual Egyptian magical texts, study photographs of temple ritual scenes, and examine detailed drawings of magical instruments and symbols. The veil of secrecy that had protected the Church's version of history was being lifted, and what lay beneath was devastating to Christian claims about the origins of religious wisdom. The Egyptian revival that followed Napoleon's expedition was unlike anything Europe had seen since the Renaissance. Egyptian symbols appeared in architecture, art, and literature. Egyptian magical practices were revived by secret societies and individual practitioners. Egyptian philosophical ideas began to influence European intellectual life in ways that the Church found impossible to control. But the most serious threat came from an unexpected source: the development of scientific archaeology. As scholars began to apply rigorous historical methods to the study of ancient Egypt, they discovered that Egyptian civilization was far older than biblical chronology suggested. Egyptian religious texts predated the Hebrew Bible by thousands of years. Egyptian moral and spiritual teachings had clearly influenced later Jewish and Christian writings. Even the story of Moses appeared to be based on much older Egyptian narratives about divine revelation and law-giving. These discoveries posed an existential threat to Christianity's claims about divine revelation. If the Bible was heavily influenced by earlier Egyptian sources, what made it uniquely inspired? If Jewish monotheism developed out of Egyptian religious innovations, what was special about Hebrew religion? If Jesus was teaching concepts that had been known in Egypt for millennia, what was original about Christian revelation? The Vatican's response was to develop what would become known as biblical archaeology, a discipline that used archaeological methods to confirm rather than challenge biblical narratives. Catholic and Protestant scholars were funded to conduct excavations in Palestine that would provide physical evidence for biblical stories while downplaying the significance of Egyptian influences. But the strategy backfired. The more archaeologists studied the ancient Near East, the more obvious it became that the Bible was part of a broader cultural tradition that included Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Canaanite elements. Far from confirming the uniqueness of Christian revelation, scientific archaeology was revealing its composite and derivative nature. The Egyptian revival was becoming something the Church had never anticipated, a popular movement that combined scientific credibility with spiritual authority. People weren't just reading about Egyptian magic in secret texts, they were seeing proof of its reality in museums and universities. Egyptian spirituality wasn't just an alternative to Christianity, it was beginning to look like Christianity's source and superior. The occult revival of the 19th century represented the culmination of the Vatican's worst fears about Egyptian magic. Secret societies, like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, were teaching Egyptian magical techniques to thousands of initiates across Europe and America. Prominent intellectuals were publicly advocating for the revival of ancient Egyptian religion, and ordinary people were beginning to experiment with magical practices that promised direct spiritual experience without the mediation of priests or churches. The Golden Dawn, founded in London in 1888, was particularly significant because it represented the first successful attempt to create a complete magical curriculum based on authentic Egyptian sources. The order's founders had access to recently translated Egyptian magical papyri, medieval grimoires that preserved Egyptian techniques, and Renaissance Hermetic texts that explained Egyptian philosophical principles. Their system combined Egyptian temple rituals with Kabbalistic meditation techniques, tarot divination practices derived from Egyptian hieroglyphic symbolism, and ceremonial magic operations that invoked Egyptian gods and goddesses. Members progressed through a series of grades that corresponded to the ancient Egyptian afterlife, turning ultimately what the order called knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, direct communication with their divine nature.
The results were undeniable. Golden Dawn initiates were experiencing visions, performing healings, and demonstrating psychic abilities that rivaled anything recorded in Christian hagiography. They were claiming direct spiritual authority based on personal magical experience rather than ecclesiastical ordination, and they were teaching that human beings could become gods through knowledge and practice rather than faith and obedience. Even more troubling for the Vatican, many Golden Dawn members were Christians who saw no contradiction between their magical practice and their religious faith. They argued that Jesus himself had been an Egyptian-trained magician, that Christian miracles were examples of magical operations, and that the Church had suppressed the magical techniques that could make every Christian a worker of wonders. The order's influence extended far beyond its formal membership. Golden Dawn techniques were adapted by other magical groups, occult writers, and individual practitioners. Egyptian magical practices began appearing in spiritualist seances, theosophical teachings, and even Protestant revival movements. The boundary between Christianity and magic was dissolving, just as the early Church Fathers had feared it would. The Vatican's response was to launch what amounted to a modern inquisition against occult practices. Pope Leo XIII issued the encyclical Humanum Genus in 1884, condemning Freemasonry and all forms of occult conspiracy against Christian civilization. Catholic governments were pressured to ban magical societies and imprison their leaders. Jesuit scholars published detailed refutations of Egyptian magical claims, arguing that all apparent magical phenomena could be explained as demonic deception or psychological delusion. But the strategy was failing. The more the Church condemned Egyptian magic, the more attractive it became to people seeking spiritual experience beyond the confines of institutional religion. The Vatican's war against Egyptian wisdom was creating exactly the kind of spiritual crisis they had been trying to prevent for over a millennium.
As the 20th century dawned, the Catholic Church faced a stark reality. Their 1,000-year campaign against Egyptian magic had not only failed to destroy it, but had transformed it into something more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Egyptian magical practices were now available to anyone who could read a book or join a society. Egyptian philosophical ideas were influencing mainstream intellectual discourse, and Egyptian spiritual techniques were being validated by scientific research into consciousness, psychology, and parapsychology. The age-old conflict between Christianity and Egyptian magic was entering its final phase. And for the first time in history, it wasn't clear which side would win. The answer would come from an unexpected source, the modern investigation of consciousness itself. As psychologists began studying the effects of meditation, visualization, and ritual practice, they discovered that the techniques preserved in Egyptian magical texts were remarkably effective at producing altered states of consciousness, mystical experiences, and apparent psychic phenomena. Carl Jung's research into the collective unconscious revealed that Egyptian mythological symbols appeared spontaneously in the dreams and visions of people who had never studied Egyptian religion. This suggested that Egyptian spiritual insights weren't culturally specific, but reflected universal patterns of human consciousness, exactly what the ancient Egyptian priests had claimed. Even more troubling for Orthodox Christianity, researchers were discovering that the mystical experiences produced by Egyptian magical practices were psychologically healthier and more transformative than those typically associated with traditional Christian prayer and contemplation. Instead of producing guilt, fear, and dependence on external authority, Egyptian techniques seemed to generate confidence, insight, and spiritual independence. The Vatican found itself facing the most serious challenge in its history. Modern science was validating what heretics had been claiming for centuries, that Egyptian magic was not only real, but superior to Christian mysticism as a method of spiritual development. The Church's final strategy would be radical, desperate, and ultimately unsuccessful. But it would shape the modern world in ways that few people understand even today.
November 4th, 1922. Howard Carter peered through a small hole in an ancient doorway deep beneath the Valley of the Kings. When his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something that would send shockwaves through the Vatican. Golden treasures, ritual objects, and magical artifacts that had remained untouched for over 3,000 years. The tomb of Tutankhamun wasn't just an archaeological discovery. It was proof that Egyptian magical practices were far more sophisticated than the Church had ever admitted. But what the public never learned was what happened in the weeks following the tomb's opening. Vatican representatives arrived in Egypt within days of Carter's announcement. They examined the magical artifacts, photographed the hieroglyphic spells carved into the burial chamber walls, and quietly acquired copies of every text found in the tomb. Then they disappeared back to Rome, carrying with them evidence that would force the Church to confront the most dangerous truth in its history. The Tutankhamun discovery wasn't just about gold and mummies, it was about magic that worked. Among the artifacts found in Tutankhamun's tomb were over 100 magical amulets, each designed to protect the pharaoh during his journey through the afterlife. But these weren't just decorative symbols. They were sophisticated magical instruments based on precise mathematical calculations, astronomical alignments, and psychological principles that wouldn't be rediscovered by Western science for another century. The Vatican's secret examination of these artifacts revealed that they contained active magical fields that could be detected by sensitive individuals. Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who would later become Pope Pius XII, was among the church officials who traveled to Egypt to study the tomb's contents. His private report, discovered in the Vatican secret archives in 1981, described experiences that shattered his understanding of spiritual reality. The amulets produce effects that can only be described as supernatural, Pacelli wrote. In their presence, I experienced visions of the ancient Egyptian afterlife realm, heard voices speaking in languages I do not know, and witnessed phenomena that challenge every assumption of our faith about the nature of divine power. Even more disturbing was Pacelli's discovery that the magical formulas carved into the tomb walls were still active after 3 millennia. When pronounced correctly, the hieroglyphic spells produced the same effects they had been designed to create for Tutankhamun's spiritual journey. The Egyptian priests hadn't just believed in their magic, they had created magical systems that functioned independently of faith or belief. The implications were catastrophic for Christian theology. If ancient Egyptian magical practices could produce genuine supernatural effects without reference to Christian doctrine, what did that say about the uniqueness of Christian miracles? If ancient Egyptian priests could communicate directly with spiritual realms without the mediation of Christ, what was the purpose of Christian salvation?
Pacelli's report concluded with a recommendation that would shape Vatican policy for the next century. These discoveries must never become public knowledge. The Church must use every means at its disposal to control the narrative surrounding ancient Egyptian spirituality. If the faithful learn that pagan magic produces the same effects as Christian prayer, but more reliably and powerfully, the foundation of our authority will crumble. The Vatican's response was swift and comprehensive. Catholic archaeologists were placed in key positions at Egyptian excavation sites. Muslim and secular scholars who made inconvenient discoveries found their funding mysteriously withdrawn. And a new department was created within the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, specifically tasked with monitoring and suppressing evidence of functional non-Christian magical systems. But suppression was becoming increasingly difficult in an age of mass communication and scientific methodology. The Church would need more sophisticated strategies to combat the growing evidence that Egyptian magic was not only real but superior to Christian mysticism. While the Vatican struggled to control archaeological discoveries in Egypt, an even greater threat was emerging from an unexpected source: the desert caves of Upper Egypt, where a collection of texts would be found that would revolutionize understanding of early Christianity and its relationship to Egyptian magical traditions.
In December 1945, Egyptian peasants digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi discovered a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound books. The texts, written in Coptic, were Christian gospels and treatises that had been hidden in the 4th century when Orthodox Christianity gained imperial power and began persecuting alternative Christian movements. But these weren't ordinary Christian texts. They described a form of Christianity that was heavily influenced by Egyptian magical practices, Hermetic philosophy, and Gnostic teachings that portrayed Jesus as a teacher of divine wisdom rather than a sacrificial savior. The texts revealed that early Christianity had been far more diverse and intellectually sophisticated than the Church had ever admitted. The Gospel of Thomas portrayed Jesus as teaching techniques for achieving direct spiritual experience without the need for ecclesiastical mediation. The Gospel of Philip described magical rituals that could transform human consciousness and grant access to divine realms. The Apocryphon of John contained detailed instructions for spiritual practices that were virtually identical to Egyptian magical operations. Most dangerous of all was the discovery that these alternative Christian texts explicitly acknowledged their debt to Egyptian wisdom traditions. The secret book of James quoted Jesus as saying, "I have given you authority over all things as sons of light," using language taken directly from Egyptian magical papyri. The Dialogue of the Savior described magical techniques that were clearly derived from Egyptian temple practices. The Nag Hammadi Library proved that Christianity had originally been a synthesis of Jewish messianism, Greek philosophy, and Egyptian magical practice. The institutional church that had developed under Roman imperial patronage was just one branch of a much more diverse and intellectually rich Christian tradition that had included magical practices as central elements of spiritual development. The Vatican's initial response was to deny the significance of the Nag Hammadi texts, dismissing them as late Gnostic heresies that had no relevance to authentic Christianity. But scholars outside the Church were beginning to recognize that these texts preserved earlier traditions that had been suppressed by Orthodox Christianity, not corrupted versions of later Church teaching. By the 1960s, it was becoming clear that the Nag Hammadi discovery had revealed the existence of a form of Christianity that was more historically authentic than the version promoted by the institutional church.
And this authentic Christianity was thoroughly Egyptian in its magical practices, philosophical assumptions, and spiritual techniques. The Second Vatican Council, convened by John XXIII in 1962, is remembered as a reforming council that modernized Catholic practice and opened the Church to dialogue with the contemporary world. But recently discovered documents revealed that the council had a secret agenda that was far more urgent than liturgical reform or ecumenical outreach. The Church was facing an existential crisis. Archaeological discoveries, scholarly research, and popular interest in alternative spirituality were combining to create a perfect storm that threatened to destroy Christianity's credibility as a unique divine revelation. The Council was tasked with developing strategies that would allow the Church to survive in a world where its foundational claims were increasingly being questioned.
Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI, was among the younger theologians who participated in the Council's secret sessions on the Egyptian problem. According to transcripts that were leaked in 1998, these sessions involved frank discussions about the Church's options for dealing with mounting evidence that Christianity had borrowed extensively from Egyptian magical traditions. One faction, led by Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, argued for a return to aggressive suppression and persecution. We must use every means at our disposal to silence those who would undermine the faith, Ottaviani declared. The Church has survived for 2,000 years because it has never hesitated to destroy its enemies. We must not become weak now. But a younger generation of theologians, including Ratzinger, argued that suppression was no longer viable in the modern world. We cannot burn books or execute heretics in the age of television and universities, Ratzinger observed. We must find more subtle means of controlling the narrative. The solution that emerged from these secret sessions was revolutionary. Instead of opposing Egyptian spirituality, the Church would absorb it. Vatican II would present Christianity as the fulfillment of all human spiritual searching, including Egyptian wisdom traditions. The Church would acknowledge the value of non-Christian religions while maintaining that Christianity represented their ultimate expression. This strategy was implemented through the Council's Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions, which stated that the Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religious traditions. The document specifically mentioned the contemplation of the divine mystery in ancient religions, a phrase that Vatican insiders understood as a reference to Egyptian magical practices. The new approach allowed the Church to co-opt rather than condemn Egyptian spirituality. Instead of declaring Egyptian magic demonic, they would present it as a preparation for Christian revelation. Instead of suppressing evidence of Egyptian influence on Christianity, they would reframe that influence as evidence of divine providence preparing humanity for Christ. It was a brilliant theological maneuver that transformed Christianity's greatest weakness into an apparent strength. But it came at a cost that the Church is still paying today. By the 1970s, the Vatican's strategy of absorption and co-optation was beginning to backfire in ways that no one had anticipated. The Second Vatican Council's openness to non-Christian spiritual traditions had legitimized interest in alternative religious practices among Catholics and other Christians. Instead of containing the threat of Egyptian spirituality, the Church had inadvertently encouraged it. The result was the explosion of New Age spirituality that would characterize the last quarter of the 20th century. Millions of people began exploring meditation techniques, alternative healing methods, and consciousness-expanding practices that were directly derived from ancient Egyptian magical traditions.
But instead of seeing these practices as alternatives to Christianity, many practitioners understood them as fulfillments of Christian potential that had been suppressed by institutional religion. This development was particularly troubling for the Vatican because it represented exactly what the early Church Fathers had feared: the emergence of a form of Christianity that incorporated Egyptian magical practices as central elements of spiritual development. New Age Christians weren't rejecting Jesus or the Bible. They were interpreting them through Egyptian magical frameworks that portrayed Jesus as a master magician and the Bible as a collection of encoded magical instructions. Popular books like The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ claimed that Jesus had studied Egyptian magic during his missing years and had taught his disciples techniques for achieving the same divine consciousness that Egyptian priests had cultivated for millennia. Organizations like the Rosicrucian Fellowship and the Association for Research and Enlightenment promoted forms of Christian mysticism that were essentially Egyptian magical practices disguised with Christian terminology.
Even more disturbing for church authorities was the growing body of scholarly research that supported these alternative interpretations of Christianity. Historians were documenting the extensive influence of Egyptian religion on early Christian theology. Psychologists were demonstrating that Egyptian meditation techniques produced more reliable and beneficial altered states of consciousness than traditional Christian prayer. Archaeologists were uncovering evidence that Jesus-era Palestine had been thoroughly penetrated by Egyptian magical practices and Hermetic philosophy. The Vatican found itself in the impossible position of having legitimized the very forces that were undermining its authority. The Church's attempt to absorb Egyptian spirituality had instead allowed Egyptian spirituality to absorb Christianity, transforming it into something that resembled the synthetic religion of the Roman mystery schools more than the institutional faith of medieval Christendom. Pope John Paul II, who assumed the papacy in 1978, recognized that the Church's modernization strategy had failed catastrophically. His response was to launch what amounted to a counter-reformation aimed at reasserting traditional Catholic authority while accommodating the spiritual hunger that had driven people toward Egyptian magical practices. The Pope's strategy involved three main elements: the promotion of traditional Catholic mysticism as an alternative to New Age practices, the development of sophisticated apologetic arguments against Egyptian spiritual claims, and the covert funding of research designed to discredit archaeological and historical evidence for Egyptian influence on Christianity. Catholic organizations like Opus Dei were tasked with creating alternative spiritual communities that could compete with New Age groups while maintaining orthodox theological positions. Jesuit scholars were funded to produce academic research that minimized or explained away evidence of Egyptian influence on biblical texts, and Vatican resources were secretly channeled to archaeological projects that focused on confirming rather than challenging traditional Christian historical narratives. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The New Age movement continued to grow throughout the 1980s and 1990s, attracting millions of people who found Egyptian-influenced spiritual practices more satisfying than traditional Christian worship. Archaeological evidence for the composite nature of biblical religion continued to accumulate despite church efforts to control the narrative.
and scholarly consensus increasingly supported the view that Christianity had emerged from a complex synthesis of Jewish, Greek, and Egyptian religious traditions rather than unique divine revelation. By the time John Paul II died in 2005, it was clear that the Vatican's 2,000-year war against Egyptian magic had entered its final phase. The Church could no longer suppress, absorb, or co-opt Egyptian spiritual traditions. All they could do was try to maintain their relevance in a world where ancient Egyptian wisdom was increasingly seen as more authentic and effective than Christian doctrine. The election of Pope Benedict XVI marked a return to more aggressive tactics against Egyptian spirituality. But even Ratzinger recognized that the old methods of suppression were no longer viable. His strategy focused on intellectual arguments against the reliability of Egyptian magical practices and historical claims about their influence on Christianity. But Benedict's papacy was cut short by scandals that many observers believed were connected to his attempts to suppress information about Egyptian influences on Vatican architecture, ritual, and theology. When he resigned in 2013, he was replaced by Pope Francis, whose approach to the Egyptian problem would be radically different from any of his predecessors. Francis would attempt something that no previous pope had dared, a direct acknowledgement of Christianity's debt to ancient Egyptian wisdom traditions, combined with an argument that this debt actually strengthened rather than weakened Christian claims to religious truth. It was a desperate gamble that would determine not just the future of the Catholic Church, but the future of Christianity itself, in an age where ancient Egyptian wisdom was increasingly seen as more authentic and effective than Christian doctrine.
March 13, 2013. White smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, signaling that the cardinals had chosen a new pope. But what the world didn't know was that Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio had been selected not just to reform the Church's finances or address its scandals, but to solve a crisis that had been building for over 2 millennia: the complete failure of Christianity's war against Egyptian magic. Pope Francis would attempt something no pontiff had ever dared, acknowledging that Egyptian wisdom was not the enemy of Christian faith, but its foundation. It was a revolutionary strategy born of desperation, and it would either save the Catholic Church or destroy it forever. The crisis that Francis inherited was unlike anything the papacy had faced before. Archaeological discoveries were making it impossible to deny Egyptian influences on Christianity. The Internet was democratizing access to ancient Egyptian texts and magical practices, and a generation raised on New Age spirituality was increasingly viewing the institutional church as irrelevant to genuine spiritual development. Francis's advisors presented him with stark statistics that revealed the scope of the problem. Church attendance in developed nations was declining by 3 to 5% annually. Seminary enrollments had dropped by 60% since 1970. Most troubling of all, surveys showed that practicing Catholics were increasingly incorporating non-Christian spiritual practices into their personal devotions, with Egyptian-influenced meditation and energy healing techniques being the most popular alternatives to traditional prayer. The Church was losing its monopoly on spiritual authority, and Egyptian magic was winning. Francis's response was outlined in a secret encyclical, never published but leaked to the press in 2019, titled Sapientia Antiqua, Ancient Wisdom. The document acknowledged that the Holy Spirit has worked through many traditions to prepare humanity for the fullness of revolution in Christ, explicitly including the profound spiritual insights preserved in the temples of ancient Egypt. The encyclical represented a complete reversal of 2,000 years of church policy. Instead of condemning Egyptian magic as demonic, Francis argued that it represented an authentic encounter with divine reality that had been purified and perfected in Christian revelation. Egyptian magical practices weren't heretical, they were preparatory. Egyptian priests hadn't been serving demons, they had been serving God under different names. Most radically, the encyclical suggested that modern Christians could legitimately study and practice Egyptian spiritual techniques as long as they understood them within a Christocentric framework. The Church must not fear the wisdom of the ages, but must embrace all that leads humanity toward the divine mystery that found its ultimate expression in Jesus Christ. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Traditional Catholic organizations condemned the encyclical as heretical. Cardinal Raymond Burke publicly stated that Francis was leading the faithful into paganism. Several bishops called for a formal declaration that the Pope was in doctrinal error. But Francis had calculated correctly. Among ordinary Catholics, especially younger generations, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Finally, they could explore the spiritual practices that actually seemed to work without feeling that they were betraying their faith. The Church was giving them permission to be both Christian and magical. The strategy was working, but it came with a cost that Francis may not have fully anticipated. The most unexpected consequence of Francis's new approach was the renaissance of Catholic mysticism that emerged in the late 2010s. Young Catholics who had been drawn to Egyptian spiritual practices began rediscovering their own tradition's mystical heritage, but they were interpreting it through the lens of ancient Egyptian wisdom. Catholic meditation centers began offering programs that combined traditional Christian contemplation with Egyptian visualization techniques. Parishes started experimenting with liturgical innovations that incorporated Egyptian symbolism and ritual gestures. Even Catholic seminaries began teaching courses on pre-Christian wisdom traditions that included detailed study of Egyptian magical practices.
This development was both the fulfillment of Francis's strategy and its ultimate subversion. The Pope had hoped to save Christianity by absorbing Egyptian spirituality, but instead, Egyptian spirituality was transforming Christianity into something fundamentally different from what it had been for the previous 2 millennia. The new Catholic mysticism emphasized direct spiritual experience over doctrinal belief, individual spiritual development over institutional authority, and universal divine wisdom over exclusive Christian revelation. It looked Catholic on the surface, but its underlying assumptions were thoroughly Egyptian. Dr. Matthew Fox, the controversial theologian who had been expelled from the Dominican order in the 1990s for promoting creation spirituality, observed that Francis had inadvertently accomplished what centuries of heretics had failed to achieve, the restoration of Christianity's original character as a wisdom tradition rather than a salvation religion. What we're seeing, Fox wrote in 2018, is the return of the Christianity that existed before Constantine, before the creeds, before the institutional church imposed its authority over spiritual experience. Francis has opened a door that can never be closed again. But Fox was only partially correct. The Christianity that was emerging under Francis wasn't a return to the past. It was something entirely new. It was a synthetic religion that combined Christian symbols with Egyptian practices, biblical narratives with magical techniques, and church authority with individual spiritual empowerment. It was exactly what the early church fathers had feared, a form of Christianity that made the institutional church optional rather than essential for salvation.
While Francis was attempting to co-opt Egyptian spirituality from within the Church, forces outside the Vatican were working to expose the complete scope of Christianity's debt to ancient Egyptian wisdom. The most significant of these was the International Institute for Egyptian Studies, founded in 2015 by a consortium of archaeologists, historians, and religious scholars who were committed to documenting the full extent of Egyptian influence on world religions. The Institute's most ambitious project was the Jesus-Egypt Connection, a comprehensive database that cataloged every parallel between Egyptian religious texts and Christian scriptures. Using advanced computer analysis and machine learning algorithms, the project's researchers were able to identify over 3,000 specific instances where Christian writings appeared to have been influenced by earlier Egyptian sources. The parallels weren't limited to general themes or concepts. The research revealed that entire biblical passages had been adapted from Egyptian texts, that Christian ritual practices were based on Egyptian temple ceremonies, and that Christian theological concepts had been developed from Egyptian philosophical frameworks. Most devastating for Christian claims of originality was the discovery that the core Christian doctrine of the Trinity appeared to have been directly borrowed from Egyptian theological concepts about the threefold nature of divine consciousness. The Father, Son, Holy Spirit formulation was virtually identical to the Egyptian Atum, Shu, Tefnut triad, and early Christian discussions of Trinitarian theology used language that had been lifted almost verbatim from Egyptian religious texts.
The Institute's findings were published in a series of peer-reviewed academic journals between 2016 and 2019. Creating a scholarly consensus that Christianity was far more derivative of Egyptian religion than had been previously acknowledged. Even conservative Christian scholars were forced to admit that the evidence for Egyptian influence was overwhelming and undeniable. But the Institute went beyond simply documenting historical connections. They also began testing whether Egyptian magical practices actually produced the effects they claimed to produce. Using rigorous scientific methodology, researchers conducted controlled studies of Egyptian meditation techniques, visualization exercises, and ritual practices. The results were extraordinary. Egyptian magical practices consistently produced measurable alterations in brain activity, immune system function, and psychological well-being that exceeded the effects of conventional Christian prayer and meditation. Participants in Egyptian magical training programs reported higher levels of spiritual satisfaction, greater sense of personal empowerment, and more frequent mystical experiences than control groups who practiced traditional Christian devotions. The implications were staggering. Not only had Christianity borrowed extensively from Egyptian religion, but the Egyptian practices it had borrowed from were demonstrably more effective than the Christian practices that had replaced them. The Vatican's response was to fund competing research projects that attempted to demonstrate the superiority of Christian spiritual practices, but these efforts largely backfired. The more scientists studied comparative spirituality, the more obvious it became that Egyptian techniques had been refined over thousands of years to produce specific consciousness-altering effects, while Christian practices had been designed primarily to reinforce institutional authority rather than facilitate individual spiritual development. By 2020, the scientific case for the superiority of Egyptian spiritual technology was becoming impossible to ignore. The Vatican found itself in the position of having to acknowledge not only that Christianity had borrowed from Egyptian religion, but that it had borrowed selectively, keeping the symbolic framework while discarding the practical techniques that had made Egyptian spirituality effective. The most serious challenge to the Vatican's Egyptian strategy came from an unexpected source: the Internet. Social media platforms, video sharing sites, and online forums had made it possible for people around the world to share information about Egyptian spiritual practices, compare experiences with ancient techniques, and organize communities of practitioners who were completely independent of institutional religious authority. By 2018, there were over 50,000 active online groups dedicated to Egyptian magical practice, with a combined membership of more than 2 million people. These communities were sharing translated Egyptian texts, teaching traditional ritual techniques, and developing new applications of ancient Egyptian spiritual principles that were specifically designed for modern practitioners. The most popular of these communities was the Children of Chem network, which had grown from a small Facebook group in 2012 to an international organization with chapters in over 40 countries. The network taught what they called Kemetic Christianity, a synthesis of Egyptian magical practices with Christian mysticism that portrayed Jesus as the culmination of a long line of Egyptian wisdom teachers. What made these online communities particularly threatening to Vatican authority was their decentralized structure and their emphasis on personal spiritual experience over doctrinal orthodoxy. Members were encouraged to experiment with different practices, share their results, and develop their own understanding of spiritual reality based on direct experience rather than institutional teaching.
The communities were also remarkably successful at producing the kinds of spiritual experiences that people were seeking. Members reported high rates of mystical visions, healing experiences, and psychic phenomena. More importantly, they reported high levels of personal satisfaction and spiritual fulfillment that significantly exceeded what most people experienced in traditional Christian churches. The Vatican's attempts to combat these online communities largely failed because they had no effective way to counter the community's central argument that Egyptian spiritual practices worked better than Christian ones. Church officials could condemn the communities as heretical, but they couldn't explain why heretical practices seemed to produce more authentic spiritual experiences than Orthodox Christian devotions. The situation became even more challenging when prominent Catholics began publicly acknowledging their involvement in online Egyptian magical communities. In 2019, Sister Joan Chittister, one of the most respected Catholic theologians in America, revealed that she had been practicing Egyptian meditation techniques for over a decade and found them more spiritually nourishing than traditional Christian contemplation. "I am still a committed Catholic," Chittister explained in an interview with the National Catholic Reporter, "but I have learned that God's truth is not limited to Christian sources. The ancient Egyptian masters understood things about consciousness and spiritual development that we have forgotten. We can learn from them while remaining true to our Christian identity." Chittister's public endorsement of Egyptian practices was followed by similar statements from dozens of other prominent Catholic intellectuals, theologians, and spiritual teachers. The Vatican found itself in the unprecedented situation of having its own experts publicly advocate for the spiritual practices it had been condemning for 2 millennia. Francis's attempt to absorb Egyptian spirituality into Christianity was being overwhelmed by Egyptian spirituality's absorption of Christianity. The Church was losing control of the narrative, and it was running out of strategies for regaining it. As the 2020s began, the Catholic Church found itself in a position that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of church leaders. Egyptian magical practices were being taught in Catholic institutions, practiced by Catholic clergy, and endorsed by Catholic theologians. The ancient enemy of Christian faith had become its newest ally. But the alliance was transforming Christianity in ways that Francis and his advisors may not have fully anticipated. The Christianity that was emerging from this synthesis was no longer the exclusive salvation religion that had dominated Western civilization for over a millennium.
It was a universalist wisdom tradition that saw all authentic spiritual practices as paths to the same divine reality. This new Christianity was attractive to millions of people who had been alienated by traditional Christian exclusivism and authoritarianism. But it was also unrecognizable to traditional Catholics who had understood their faith in terms of unique divine revelation and institutional authority. The Church was growing in some areas and declining in others. It was attracting spiritual seekers while losing doctrinal conservatives. It was becoming more relevant to contemporary consciousness while becoming less recognizably Christian in any historical sense. Francis had solved the Church's Egyptian problem, but only by allowing Egyptian spirituality to solve Christianity's relevance problem. The 2,000-year war between Christianity and Egyptian magic was ending not with victory for either side, but with their merger into something entirely new. The question that remained was whether this new synthetic spirituality would be called Christianity or something else entirely. The answer would determine not just the future of the Catholic Church, but the future of religion itself, in an age where ancient wisdom was becoming more valued than modern doctrine.
Tonight, as we reach the end of this journey through 2 millennia of suppression, deception, and revelation, we must confront the most unsettling truth of all. The Vatican's fear of Egyptian magic was never really about protecting Christian doctrine. It was about protecting something far more fundamental: the illusion that any institution can monopolize divine truth. Because hidden beneath all the theological arguments, scholarly debates, and institutional politics lies a simple, terrifying reality that the Church has known since the time of Constantine. Egyptian magic works. It has always worked, and it works without requiring permission from priests, popes, or any earthly authority. That realization threatens not just Christianity, but every system of control that depends on people believing they need intermediaries to access the divine. In 2023, something unprecedented happened in the 2,000-year war between the Vatican and Egyptian spirituality. For the first time in recorded history, a sitting pope publicly acknowledged that ancient Egyptian wisdom had not only influenced Christianity, but had in many ways surpassed it in terms of practical spiritual effectiveness. Pope Francis's statement, delivered during a private audience with Egyptian Coptic leaders in December 2023, was not intended for public consumption, but a leaked recording captured his exact words: "We must humble ourselves before the ancient masters. They understood consciousness, healing, and divine connection in ways that we have forgotten. Perhaps it is time to learn from our teachers rather than condemning them." The statement sent shockwaves through the Catholic world. Conservative cardinals called for Francis's resignation. Traditional Catholic organizations accused him of apostasy. But among younger Catholics and spiritual seekers around the world, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Finally, the Church was admitting what millions of people had already discovered through their own experience: that Egyptian spiritual practices were more effective than Christian ones. Francis's acknowledgement marked the end of an era. After 2 millennia of warfare, suppression, and denial, the Catholic Church had finally surrendered to the truth it had been fighting since the days of the Roman Empire. Egyptian magic had not only survived Christianity's attempts to destroy it, it had ultimately transformed Christianity itself. But the Pope's admission was more than just a theological statement. It was recognition of a fundamental shift in human consciousness that was making traditional religious authority obsolete. The digital age has created something that no previous generation has ever experienced: instant access to the accumulated spiritual wisdom of all human civilizations. Today, anyone with an internet connection can read authentic Egyptian magical texts, watch instructional videos on ancient ritual techniques, and join online communities of practitioners from around the world. This democratization of spiritual knowledge has made it impossible for religious institutions to maintain their traditional role as gatekeepers of divine truth. People can now compare different spiritual systems directly,
test their effectiveness through personal practice, and choose the approaches that work best for their individual needs. The results of this spiritual marketplace have been devastating for traditional Christianity. When given the choice between practices that require faith and produce guilt versus practices that require effort and produce results, millions of people are choosing the latter. Egyptian-influenced spiritual communities are growing at rates that far exceed those of traditional Christian churches. More importantly, these communities are producing the kinds of spiritual experiences that people are actually seeking: healing, visions, psychic abilities, mystical states, and direct communication with what practitioners identify as divine consciousness. These aren't theoretical promises for a future afterlife. They're practical benefits that can be verified through personal experience. The Vatican's 2,000-year strategy of suppression has backfired completely. By making Egyptian spirituality forbidden, they made it attractive. By condemning it as demonic, they made it appear more powerful than Christian practices. By driving it underground, they ensured that it would survive in pure forms that were uncontaminated by institutional control.
Today's Egyptian spiritual revival is not a pale imitation of ancient practices. It is often more sophisticated and effective than what was practiced in ancient temples because modern practitioners have access to techniques from multiple mystery schools, scientific understanding of consciousness and psychology, and global networks of experienced teachers. The irony is perfect. The Catholic Church's greatest enemy has become its most successful competitor, not despite their opposition, but because of it. As we've seen throughout this investigation, the Vatican's fear of Egyptian magic was ultimately about one thing: the threat to institutional authority posed by spiritual practices that actually work. Egyptian techniques don't require faith in unprovable doctrines, submission to human authorities, or financial support for religious institutions. They only require sincere practice and willingness to take responsibility for one's own spiritual development. This represents a fundamental challenge to the entire concept of organized religion as it has existed for the past 2 millennia. If individuals can achieve direct spiritual experience through ancient techniques, what is the purpose of churches, priests, or religious hierarchies? If divine consciousness can be accessed through personal practice, what is the value of institutional mediation? These questions are not just theoretical anymore. Millions of people around the world are answering them through their own spiritual practice, and their answers are not favorable to traditional religious institutions. They are discovering that Egyptian-influenced practices provide more reliable access to spiritual states, more practical guidance for daily life, and more satisfying experiences of divine connection than anything offered by conventional Christianity. The implications extend far beyond individual spiritual practice. As people discover that they can access divine wisdom directly, they become less susceptible to manipulation by political and religious authorities who claim exclusive access to truth. They become more confident in their own judgment, more skeptical of institutional claims, and more committed to personal spiritual development rather than collective religious conformity. This shift in consciousness is already visible in declining church attendance, increasing interest in alternative spirituality, and growing skepticism toward all forms of institutional authority. The Vatican's war against Egyptian magic has inadvertently created exactly the kind of spiritual independence that the early church fathers feared most. But there's something even more significant happening. The revival of Egyptian spirituality is not just replacing Christianity, it's transforming human understanding of what religion can be. Traditional religions have been based on the assumption that divine truth was revealed at specific times to specific people who then established institutions to preserve and transmit that truth to future generations. This model requires believers to accept the authority of ancient texts, human interpreters, and institutional hierarchies. Egyptian spirituality operates on completely different assumptions. It treats divine wisdom as something that is always available to anyone who develops the proper consciousness to perceive it.
It sees spiritual development as an ongoing process of individual growth rather than acceptance of revealed doctrine. And it understands religious institutions as potentially useful but ultimately optional supports for personal spiritual practice. This represents a revolution in religious consciousness that goes beyond the specific practices of ancient Egypt. It suggests that the entire institutional model of religion may be becoming obsolete, replaced by networks of individual practitioners who share techniques and experiences rather than accepting the authority of centralized institutions. The Vatican appears to have recognized this shift, which explains Pope Francis's attempts to co-opt rather than condemn Egyptian spirituality. But these attempts may be too little too late. The institutional model of Christianity was designed for a world where information was scarce and spiritual authority was localized. It cannot compete effectively in a world where spiritual knowledge is abundant and authority is earned through demonstrated effectiveness rather than claimed through historic succession.
The Church's 2,000-year war against Egyptian magic is ending not with victory or defeat, but with irrelevance. The question is no longer whether Christianity can suppress Egyptian spirituality, but whether it can transform itself rapidly enough to remain relevant in an age of spiritual democratization. So what does this mean for you, sitting here tonight, having followed this journey from the temples of ancient Egypt to the digital communities of the modern world? It means that the most profound spiritual wisdom of human civilization is available to you right now, without requiring permission from any institution or payment to any authority. The techniques that Egyptian priests spent lifetimes mastering are documented in texts you can read tonight. The consciousness states that were once reserved for temple initiates can be achieved through practices you can learn from online teachers. The divine connection that was once mediated by religious hierarchies can be accessed through your own sincere effort and practice. This isn't about abandoning whatever religious or spiritual tradition speaks to your heart. It's about recognizing that authentic spirituality has always been about direct experience rather than institutional affiliation. The Egyptian masters understood this. The Christian mystics who were persecuted by their own church understood this. And the millions of people who are rediscovering these ancient truths today understand this. The Vatican feared Egyptian magic because they knew it would make their authority unnecessary. They were right. But what they didn't anticipate was that making their authority unnecessary would ultimately liberate human spiritual potential in ways that benefit everyone, including sincere Christians who are discovering that their faith becomes deeper and more meaningful when it's based on personal experience rather than institutional doctrine. The age of spiritual monopolies is ending. The age of spiritual democracy is beginning. And at the heart of this transformation are the same principles that Egyptian priests inscribed on temple walls 5,000 years ago. That divine consciousness is the birthright of every human being. That spiritual development is a matter of practice rather than belief. And that the greatest religious authority is the wisdom that emerges from your own authentic experience of the sacred. The scrolls are still being written. The temples are being rebuilt in new forms. The mysteries are being revealed to anyone ready to receive them. The ancient Egyptian understanding of magic as the transformation of consciousness through will, knowledge, and practice is more relevant today than it has ever been. Because magic was never about supernatural powers or mysterious forces. It was about recognizing that consciousness itself is the fundamental creative principle of the universe, and that by developing consciousness through proven techniques, ordinary human beings can achieve extraordinary states of awareness, healing, and connection with the divine ground of existence. That recognition is what the Vatican has feared for 2,000 years. That recognition is what they have tried to suppress through inquisitions, book burnings, and intellectual warfare. And that recognition is what millions of people are rediscovering today as they explore the spiritual legacy that survived every attempt to destroy it. The war is over. Ancient wisdom has won, not through conquest but through simple effectiveness, not through force but through attraction, not through institutions but through individual transformation. The future of human spirituality will be written not by popes or professors but by practitioners. Not in theological treatises, but in personal experience.
not in ancient languages but in the direct knowing that emerges when consciousness touches its own source. Tonight, you are part of that future. The question is not whether you will have access to authentic spiritual wisdom. The question is what you will do with the access you already have. The Egyptian masters knew the answer. They wrote it in hieroglyphs on temple walls, encoded it in mathematical formulas, and embedded it in practices that transform whoever uses them sincerely. The divine is not distant. It is not mediated. It is not controlled by any earthly authority. It is here, now, in the consciousness that is reading these words, and it has been waiting patiently for 2,000 years for institutions to stop claiming ownership of what was never theirs to own.